Hi, everyone. So today I'd like to talk about criminal justice as one of the contexts in which we see ongoing patterns of institutional discrimination and um, racism along racial and ethnic lines. I want to start out by talking a little bit about incarceration rates, sentencing disparities, and criminality overall, which is sort of the background against which all of this sort of occurs. So, in recent years, and it really isn't all that new, it's actually been a fairly common perception for some time. Um, we've seen an increased concern over rising rates of crime, even though since the 1990s, for most years, we've actually seen crime declining. It does fluctuate; it goes up and down from year to year. Sometimes cities or other areas will see spikes in the crime rate. Sometimes property crime will be declining, but interpersonal or violent crime might be on the rise. But generally speaking, the trend since the 1990s has been a fairly steady and consistent decline in criminality. Um, but in that same period of time, we've seen dramatic increases in both policing and incarceration. So what this suggests is that policy changes, not actual increases in criminal behavior, have contributed to creating what we call the carceral state, or a state that is characterized by high degrees of policing and incarceration. So the United States, just so you have a sense of proportionality, the United States is about 4.4% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's incarcerated population. So, of the global population that is in prison, 25% of that population is inside the United States. So that basically breaks down to about 670 people for every 100,000 people. That's between 1985 and 2015, that was a 500% increase, right? So we saw this dramatic explosion in incarceration. Um, Two primary drivers of this trend, and there are some associated sort of factors that I'll talk about as well, but the two primary drivers of this are the war on drugs, which begins in the 1960s. Nixon, in fact, first uses the term in 1971, so this is a relatively long-standing thing. We were putting it into practice before we started calling it the war on drugs, but it has been called the war on drugs for a very long time. The use of policing of possession or use of relatively small amounts of narcotics has been justification for putting significant numbers of people in prison. Not surprisingly, the population that ends up being incarcerated skews poor, and it skews toward people of color. So war on drugs, first thing that kind of factors into this. The second is the rise in what are called mandatory minimum sentences. So a mandatory minimum sentence is just what it sounds like. It is, if you are convicted of a crime, the mandatory minimum amount of time that you can be sentenced for would be set in law. This basically takes away what we used to call judicial discretion. So judges weighing the facts of the case and having received a verdict from the jury. Remember, juries determine guilt, but juries do not determine sentencing. That's a function of the judge. So the judge has some discretion in how long to sentence a person who has been convicted and found guilty of a crime, how long they go to prison. Well, mandatory minimum sentencing begins in 1952 with something called the Boggs Act, and then that gets reinforced and strengthens in 1956. It gets repealed, interestingly enough, mandatory minimums get repealed in 1970, but then get reinstated in 1984 and 1986 under the Reagan administration. So aside from a relatively brief respite, we've had mandatory minimum sentencing in place for quite a while. But what happens in the context of the war on drugs is increased policing, as I said, mostly involving possession or use of relatively small amounts of narcotics, coupled with um, these imposed mandatory minimum sentences on drug use and drug possession crimes specifically, resulted in a ballooning of the prison population in the 80s and the 90s. So data on crime is really, really tricky. Right, we have official crime reports at the local level. We have official crime reports at the federal level, but there are also victimization surveys and other sources of data. So when it comes to sort of a one definitive source on crime rates, it's really hard to say that there's any one authoritative number that we should pay attention to. But the broad pattern, when people sit down to do what we call meta-analyses, when they look at the findings of all kinds of different sources of study or data and all kinds of different studies, what we see is that blacks and Latinos do have a slightly higher crime rate than whites, but the rate is still below the arrest and incarceration rate. So, for example, a 25% crime rate among blacks, but a 38% arrest and incarceration rate for blacks, right? So it isn't just that one group is slightly more likely to engage in crime than another group. It has to do with things like policing. It has to do with the experiences that members of racial and ethnic groups have as they proceed through the criminal justice system. We know that whites are more likely to be offered plea bargains. Whites, because they also tend to be more affluent, are able to afford better representation at trial, and all kinds of different and sentences. Sentences tend to be longer for non-whites than whites. Back to those mandatory minimums, although this did change a little bit back in under the Obama administration. Before that, the sentencing disparities in sentencing, the sentencing disparities for possession or sale of cocaine reflected this kind of systemic or institutional bias that was producing a disparate incarceration rate for blacks. So, for example, to trigger a 5-year mandatory minimum, right? So to get a minimum of 5 years in prison, you would have to have 5 grams of crack cocaine. That was the federal mandatory minimum sentence for conviction of possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine. To get the same 5-year mandatory minimum for powder cocaine, you had to possess 500 grams, 100 times more to get the same 5-year sentence, right? There really isn't a tremendous amount of difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. It's essentially the way in which it's kind of produced and transported and the way you consume it as a narcotic. But in terms of potency, in terms of consequence, impact on society, right? The drugs are virtually the same. So what happens, of course, is poor people are much more likely to use crack cocaine. Affluent people are much more likely to use powder cocaine. We know that poverty is strongly overlapping with being a racial or ethnic minority in this country. So what happens is that blacks and Latinos who are convicted of cocaine possession, because they possess crack cocaine more often than powder cocaine, were much more likely to go to prison for long periods of time than affluent people, which can again read that as white. So you get this kind of disparity in sentencing that results in a concentration of or an overrepresentation of blacks and Latinos in the prison population relative to their proportion in the overall society. So differential incarceration rates by race. Here data from 2015. Just again, we've got more recent data. I just haven't updated everything yet. For blacks, for every 100,000 black people, 2,613 of them are incarcerated. For every 100,000 people of Latin American descent, the number is 1,043. And for whites, for every 100,000 white people, 457 of them are in prison. Remember, rates of criminality are virtually identical, but you see a tremendous disparity in incarceration by race, which again suggests that it's not differences in criminal behavior, but differences in policies, differences in policing, differences in sentencing guidelines, and we'll talk a little bit about those things in turn. So in 2015, blacks and Latinos were about 35% of the total population, but represented 60% of the prison population, right? So again, you see that this is, again, an institutional problem, not a problem of like individual racial discrimination. This is a systemic issue, and one of the biggest problems, one of the places where we see a significant amount of bias is in policing. We have a term for this called systemic police bias, and systemic police bias is just an inherent tendency of policing practices that produce what we call self-justifying outcomes. So here's how this works. Law enforcement target their resources at poor communities and communities of color, justifying that by saying that these populations have a higher crime rate. The evidence for the higher crime rate, of course, is the higher arrest rate. The higher arrest rate is facilitated by the fact that you spend more resources policing in those communities than in other communities. So you see that becomes a kind of self-justifying bias built into how we do policing. You over-police a community, resulting in higher arrests. You point to the fact that there are more arrests in this community than in this other community as justification for continuing to focus your resources in these overly policed communities. Or maybe they're policed just fine, but then the white communities are under-policed. Because again, if this were just a function of whether or not people were likely to engage in or were engaging in criminal behavior, we would be patrolling affluent communities and poor communities, white communities and non-white communities equally. The other issue, and we've talked a little bit about this before, but probably a good time to bring it up again, is this impact of racial profiling. And racial profiling is, as I've mentioned in a previous video, it's stopping and questioning people based on their race. And when we look at the data, we see that law enforcement is much more aggressively policing poor and minority communities than they are non-poor and non-minority communities. So we get a pretty good snapshot of what racial profiling looks like in action. So for example, a study done from 1995 to 1997 in Maryland found that 17% of all speeding drivers were black, but 70% of all traffic stops for speeding were of black motorists, right? So 17% of the speeding offenses are being committed by blacks, but 70% of all the stops for speeding were black drivers. Another study from 1985 to 1995, so a decade-long study here in Illinois, specifically in southwestern Illinois, found that 2% of all the drivers in that area of the state were Latino, but 14% of all the traffic stops in that period of time in that part of the state were Latino drivers. So law enforcement is profiling these motorists. And again, that's going to result in the issuing of more citations. It's going to result in the discovery of other illegal activities that people might be engaging in, which might lead to arrests, which again is going to create a disparate sort of pattern of conviction and incarceration. The consequence of this, or one of the consequences, aside from sort of the injustice of a racially skewed prison population, is that it's actually eroding trust in law enforcement. This actually, in the end, comes back to kind of hurt law enforcement as well, because they don't have as much cooperation in communities of color than they used to, because trust in law enforcement's been kind of eroded by this pattern of sort of selective and biased policing. So, researchers do surveys of public opinion all the time, and one of the regular things that gets surveyed in these ongoing general surveys is public opinion about police honesty. So, in 1977, the percentage of people who were reporting either high or very high trust or very high regard for law enforcement and law enforcement honesty, 1977, whites, 38% said they either felt, they either believed highly or very highly in police honesty. 34% for blacks, right? So not much of a disparity. 38% for whites, 34% for blacks. 1985, whites reporting high to very high opinions of police honesty, 48, blacks 35. 1995, same question, whites 44%, blacks 25%. So we see an increasing opinion of police honesty among whites from 1977 to 1995, but we see a really precipitous drop in the amount of trust in the black community for law enforcement, which means that people are less likely to cooperate with police. They'll call the police when a crime is being committed, but in terms of cooperating with investigations, in terms of sharing information with law enforcement, that lack of trust becomes a significant liability for people attempting to engage in law enforcement. All right, so that should be enough to give a little bit of a flavor to one of these areas in which we see persistent issues with effective policing and the systemic bias that results in a higher arrest rate, conviction rate, and an incarceration rate for non-whites relative to whites. Next time we'll talk a little bit about electoral politics and the way in which we see similar patterns of institutional race-based discrimination in voting and in politics. So again, as always, if you have any questions, please reach out and let me know. And if not, I'll just see you guys next time. Take care.